Jasmine Crockett just did something that left Beck completely speechless on live television. And what happened next may have ended his credibility as a political commentator forever. The 43-year-old Texas Congresswoman walked into that CNN studio with facts that Beck never saw coming. And in just 90 seconds, she turned one of conservative media's biggest voices into a stammering mess. The lights blazed bright in CNN's Atlanta studio as the cameras rolled for what was supposed to be a routine political debate segment. Beck sat confidently in his navy blue suit, his signature glasses reflecting the studio lights, that familiar smirk playing across his face. For over 2 decades, Beck had been a heavyweight in conservative media. From his days at a major news network to building his own media empire, he'd taken on politicians, celebrities, and activists, rarely meeting his match. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was about to face Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from Texas's 30th District, and he had no idea what was coming. The segment was titled America's Future, Progressive versus Conservative Vision, and Beck had come prepared for what he thought would be an easy win. After all, Crockett was relatively new to Congress, elected just 2 years ago, and Beck figured his decades of experience would easily overwhelm the freshman Democrat. CNN host Laura Mitchell set the stage. Tonight, we have 2 very different visions for America's future. Beck, conservative commentator and founder of Torchlight Media, and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from Texas. You've been very critical of the progressive movement. What's your main concern? Beck leaned forward, his voice carrying that dramatic tone he perfected over years of radio and television. Laura, what we're seeing is the complete destruction of American values. These progressive politicians like Ms. Crockett here are pushing policies that will bankrupt our nation and destroy the family unit. They want to defund police, open our borders, and teach our children that America is evil. He turned slightly toward Crockett, his expression condescending. With all due respect to the Congresswoman, she represents everything that's wrong with the Democratic Party today. Young, inexperienced politicians who think they can solve complex problems with simple socialist solutions. The studio audience was mixed, some nodding along with Beck's words, others shifting uncomfortably. Crockett sat calmly, her hands folded, a slight smile on her face that Beck mistook for nervousness. What he didn't know was that she'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, and she had information that would completely destroy his argument. Laura Mitchell turned to Crockett. Congresswoman, how do you respond to those characterizations? This was the moment. Crockett looked directly at Beck, her voice calm but strong. Mr. Beck, I appreciate you sharing your concerns, but I think we need to talk about facts instead of fear-mongering. Beck chuckled, interrupting her. Facts? Let me give you some facts. Crime is skyrocketing in Democratic cities. Inflation is destroying working families, and your party wants to spend trillions more on programs we can't afford. Crockett didn't flinch. That's interesting, Mr. Beck. Since you want to talk about spending and fiscal responsibility, let's discuss that. She reached into her folder and pulled out a document. I have here the financial records for your company, Torchlight Media, which are public due to your corporate structure. Would you like to explain to the American people how a man who lectures about fiscal responsibility managed to lose $47 million of investor money in just the last 3 years? The studio went dead silent. Beck's confident smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of shock and panic. Laura Mitchell leaned forward, clearly surprised by this turn. The audience began murmuring, some pulling out phones to record what was clearly becoming a viral moment. Beck stammered. That's taken out of context. Business operations are complex, but Crockett wasn't finished. It gets better, Mr. Beck. You spent the last 5 years telling people that government spending is out of control, but your own company took $12 million in emergency relief loans during the pandemic. Loans that were forgiven by the same government you constantly attack. The camera zoomed in on Beck's face, which had gone pale. His hands began to shake slightly as he gripped his notes. This wasn't going according to plan at all. Furthermore, Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength. You've been telling people that progressive policies don't work, but let's look at the results in my district. Since I took office, we've brought in $400 million in federal infrastructure funding, reduced unemployment by 23%, and opened 3 new community health centers. What has your media empire done for ordinary Americans besides spread fear and misinformation? The audience was now completely engaged, some standing to get a better look at the confrontation. Beck tried to interrupt, but Crockett held up her hand. "I'm not done, Mr. Beck. You see, this is exactly what's wrong with conservative media today. You profit off people's fears while your own house is falling apart. You lecture about responsibility while taking government handouts. You talk about American values while building your wealth off division and hate." Beck's face was now bright red, his composure completely shattered. The man who had built his career on passionate, articulate arguments was reduced to sputtering denials. "You can't just... This is character assassination." Crockett smiled calmly. "No, Mr. Beck, this is accountability. Something you've avoided for far too long." The timer showed they were only 90 seconds into what was supposed to be a 20-minute segment, but Beck was already completely destroyed. Laura Mitchell looked stunned, clearly realizing she was witnessing something extraordinary. To understand how devastating this moment was, you need to know who these two people really are and what this confrontation represented for American politics. Glenn Beck didn't start as a political commentator. He began his career as a radio DJ in the 1970s, working his way up through local stations across the country. But it was his move into political commentary in the 2000s that made him famous. His show on a major news network drew millions of viewers with his emotional, sometimes tearful presentations about America's decline. Beck had built an empire on fear, climate change conspiracies, claims about government overreach, warnings about socialist takeovers. He'd perfected the art of making middle-class Americans terrified about their future. When the network let him go, he didn't disappear. Instead, he founded Torchlight Media, promising to be the voice of truth that mainstream media wouldn't tell. By the time of this debate, Beck had become more than just a commentator. He was a movement leader with millions of followers who hung on his every word. His books became bestsellers. His live events sold out, and his online streaming service had hundreds of thousands of subscribers paying monthly fees to hear his version of reality. But behind the success, cracks were showing. Torchlight Media had been struggling financially for years. Several high-profile hosts had left, citing concerns about the company's direction. Advertisers were pulling out due to controversy after controversy. Beck's personal life had also been tumultuous, with a series of health scares and family issues that he'd shared publicly, sometimes in emotional on-air breakdowns. Still, Beck remained confident in his ability to debate and destroy political opponents. He'd taken on senators, governors, and even presidential candidates, usually coming out on top through his combination of preparation, passion, and media savvy. When CNN offered him the chance to debate a freshman Congresswoman, he saw it as an easy victory that would boost his profile and remind people why he was still relevant. Jasmine Crockett represented everything Beck claimed to oppose, but her story was far more complex than he realized. Born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, Crockett hadn't grown up privileged. Her mother was a teacher, her father worked in construction, and money was always tight. She'd worked her way through college and law school, becoming a successful attorney before ever thinking about politics. What drove Crockett into politics wasn't ambition for power, but frustration with injustice. As a civil rights attorney, she'd seen too many cases where ordinary people were crushed by systems designed to help the wealthy and connected. She'd represented families facing foreclosure, workers cheated out of wages, and communities fighting environmental racism. When she ran for the Texas legislature, few people gave her a chance. Her opponent had more money, more endorsements, and more name recognition. But Crockett had something else. She had the trust of people who felt forgotten by the political system. She won by focusing on practical solutions rather than ideological battles. Her success in the Texas legislature caught national attention. While other politicians gave speeches, Crockett passed laws. She helped expand healthcare coverage, increase funding for public schools, and create job training programs for displaced workers. When a congressional seat opened up, she was the obvious choice for Democrats looking for fresh leadership. But Crockett brought something unique to Congress that many of her colleagues lacked. She wasn't afraid of fights, and she did her homework. While other members relied on staff for research, Crockett dove deep into issues herself. She read the fine print, analyzed the data, and came prepared for every debate with facts that her opponents couldn't dispute. That's exactly what had happened with Glenn Beck. When she learned about the CNN debate, Crockett didn't just prepare talking points about progressive policies. She researched Beck himself. She studied his business dealings, his financial records, his public statements over the years. She looked for inconsistencies, hypocrisies, and vulnerabilities that no one else had noticed. What she found was devastating. Beck's media empire, which he portrayed as successful and independent, was actually hemorrhaging money. The company had taken millions in government assistance, while Beck preached about the dangers of government dependency. Most damaging of all, internal documents showed that Beck's own staff had serious concerns about the accuracy of claims made on his shows. This wasn't just about two politicians disagreeing on policy. This was about the credibility of conservative media itself. Beck represented an entire ecosystem of commentators, podcasters, and influencers who made millions by telling people that progressives were destroying America. If Crockett could expose Beck's hypocrisy and incompetence on live television, it would send shock waves through that entire world. The stakes couldn't have been higher. For Beck, this was supposed to be a routine appearance that would remind people of his relevance and expertise. A loss to a freshman congresswoman would be humiliating and potentially damaging to his business and reputation. For Crockett, this was a chance to show that progressive politicians could fight back against conservative media attacks. Too often, Democrats have been passive when faced with right-wing criticism. Crockett was determined to show a different way, one where progressives came armed with facts and weren't afraid to use them. As they sat in that CNN studio, both of them knew that millions of people would see this debate. Clips would be shared on social media, analyzed by pundits, and remembered for years to come. In the age of viral politics, 90 seconds could change everything. Beck thought he was facing just another naive progressive politician. Crockett knew she was about to destroy one of conservative media's biggest names. The only question was whether the audience was ready for what was about to happen. The cameras were rolling, the lights were bright, and America was watching. The cameras were still rolling in CNN's Atlanta studio, and the air was thick with tension. What had started as a routine political debate had transformed into a high-stakes showdown. Glenn Beck, his face flushed and his confidence shaken, sat gripping his notes as if they could anchor him against the storm unleashed by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Her devastating opening salvo, exposing his company's financial losses and reliance on government loans, had left him reeling. The audience, a mix of supporters and skeptics, leaned forward, sensing that the real battle was just beginning. CNN host Laura Mitchell, her composure barely masking her astonishment, tried to steer the segment back on track. "Mr. Beck," Laura said, her voice steady but curious, "the Congresswoman has raised some serious points about your business practices. Do you want to respond to those specific allegations?" Beck cleared his throat, his media training kicking in as he tried to regain his footing. "Laura, what we just saw was a perfect example of how the radical left operates. They can't win on ideas, so they dig through business records and try to destroy people personally. This is exactly the kind of politics that's tearing our country apart." It was a weak deflection, and the audience could feel it. His usual fiery delivery sounded hollow, more desperate than defiant. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on Beck, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "Mr. Beck, respectfully, you can't call this a personal attack when I'm simply quoting your own public statements and comparing them to your own public actions. You've built a career telling people that government spending is wasteful and dangerous, but your company, Torchlight Media, took $12 million in emergency relief loans. You've criticized progressive policies, Yet you provide those same policies to your own employees. This isn't about politics. This is about honesty. Beck's hands trembled as he tried to interrupt, but Crockett's voice cut through like a blade. You mentioned the radical left, but let's talk about what's really radical. What's radical is making millions by spreading fear and misinformation. What's radical is taking government handouts while telling others they're evil. What's radical is calling teachers, police officers, and public servants enemies of America because they don't share your views. The studio audience was now completely silent, hanging on every word. Some were recording with their phones, knowing they were witnessing a moment that would dominate headlines and social media feeds within hours. Beck's face grew redder, his composure unraveling further. "You don't understand what I've been trying to do," he said, his voice rising. "I've been trying to wake people up to the threats facing this country. I've been fighting to preserve American values and liberty by lying to people." Crockett interrupted smoothly, pulling out another document from her folder. "Mr. Beck, I have here a list of claims you've made on your show over the past 5 years. You told your audience that climate change was a hoax designed to control their lives, but internal emails from Torchlight Media show your executives were preparing your facilities for extreme weather events. You told people renewable energy would destroy the economy, but your own investment portfolio includes significant holdings in solar and wind companies." The studio erupted in gasps and murmurs. Even Laura Mitchell looked stunned, her eyes darting between Crockett's documents and Beck's increasingly pale face. Beck opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out, his jaw working soundlessly as the weight of Crockett's revelations hit him. She wasn't done. "You told people that immigration was destroying American communities," she continued, her voice steady and unrelenting. "But your own companies have hired hundreds of immigrant workers, many of them undocumented, to keep your labor costs low." The audience's murmurs grew louder, a mix of shock and disbelief. Beck finally found his voice, but it came out as a desperate whisper. How do you have access to that information?" Crockett's smile was slight but piercing. "It's called research, Mr. Beck, something journalists used to do before they became entertainers. Everything I've cited comes from public records, court filings, and documents your own company filed with government agencies. The only reason people don't know about your hypocrisy is because no one bothered to look until now." She turned to face the camera directly, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "This is what we need more of in American politics. Not more fear-mongering and division, but actual accountability. When someone makes millions by spreading misinformation, we need to call them out. When someone profits from the very policies they claim to oppose, we need to expose that hypocrisy." Beck made one last desperate attempt to regain control. He stood up from his chair, pointing at Crockett, his voice cracking. "This is exactly what I've been warning people about. This is how authoritarians operate. They silence their critics by destroying them personally." The gesture backfired spectacularly. His shaking hand and trembling voice made him look frantic rather than authoritative. The cameras captured every moment of his unraveling, broadcasting it to millions of viewers. Crockett remained seated, her composure unshaken. "Mr. Beck, I'm not silencing you. You're free to say whatever you want on your shows, but you're not free to spread misinformation without consequences. You're not free to lie to people without being called out. And you're certainly not free to profit from hypocrisy without being exposed." Beck slowly sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. His shoulders sagged, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. He looked like a man who knew his empire was crumbling. Laura Mitchell, recognizing that the segment had reached a fever pitch, turned to the camera. "We've certainly witnessed an unprecedented exchange here tonight. We're going to take a quick commercial break, but when we return, we'll have more from our guests." As the cameras cut to commercial, Beck sat in stunned silence, his phone already buzzing with messages from his staff and business partners. He knew the clips from this debate would be shared millions of times within hours, each one chipping away at the reputation he'd spent decades building. Crockett, meanwhile, remained calm, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. She hadn't come to destroy Beck personally. She'd come to show that progressive politicians could fight back against conservative media attacks with facts and preparation. And in just a few minutes, she'd proven that the conservative media machine, built on fear and misinformation, was vulnerable when confronted with truth. The stakes of this moment went beyond one debate. For Beck, this was a public humiliation that threatened his entire career. His audience, his advertisers, and his investors would all be watching to see how he responded. For Crockett, this was a chance to redefine how Democrats engaged with right-wing media. Too often, progressives had shied away from confrontations, fearing they couldn't win against the polished outrage of commentators like Beck. Crockett had shown that with enough preparation and courage, the tables could be turned. As the commercial break ended, the studio lights came back up, and the cameras focused on the two figures at the center of the storm. Beck looked defeated, his earlier bravado replaced by a hollow stare. Crockett sat poised, her folder of documents still in hand, ready to continue if needed. Laura Mitchell took a deep breath, knowing the next few minutes would be just as critical. "We're back with Glenn Beck and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett," she said. "Before the break, we heard some serious allegations about media responsibility and business practices. Mr. Beck, would you like to address the Congresswoman's points further?" Beck's response was halting, his voice lacking its usual fire. "Laura, I think it's clear that this is an attempt to distract from the real issues facing America. My company has always been about informing people, about protecting liberty. We've created jobs. We've built a platform for truth." His words trailed off, unconvincing even to himself. Crockett didn't let the moment pass. "Mr. Beck, you keep talking about truth, but let's talk about your track record. You told your audience that mail-in voting would lead to massive fraud. You presented evidence that was later debunked as completely fabricated. How many of your viewers believe those lies? How many of them acted on the fear you spread?" Beck's face contorted with anger, but his response was weak. "I never told anyone to act violently. You can't blame me for what other people do." "I'm not blaming you for their actions," Crockett replied, her voice like steel. "I'm blaming you for lying to them in the first place. You built your business model on making people afraid and angry, and then you act surprised when that fear and anger has consequences." The audience was now fully engrossed, some whispering to each other, others still recording. Even the camera operators seemed transfixed by the exchange. Beck tried one final counterattack. "At least I'm fighting for American values. At least I'm not trying to turn this country into a socialist nightmare. Your party wants to defund the police, open the borders, and teach children to hate their own country." Crockett had been waiting for this. She smiled slightly and pulled out her final piece of evidence. "Mr. Beck, since you brought up defunding the police, let's talk about your own relationship with law enforcement. I have records showing that your security company, the one you use to protect your properties, is staffed primarily by off-duty police officers whose salaries are paid by the same government you constantly attack." Beck's mouth opened, then closed, his eyes wide with shock. Crockett continued, unrelenting. "Furthermore, your company has received tax breaks and subsidies from local governments worth over $8 million. You've literally profited from the government spending you claim to oppose. You've built your wealth by taking money from taxpayers while telling those same taxpayers that government spending is evil." The studio erupted. Some audience members began clapping. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Beck looked like he wanted to disappear from his chair. "And since you mentioned socialism," Crockett pressed on, "let's talk about your employees. Your company offers comprehensive health insurance, paid family leave, and retirement benefits. All policies you've called socialist when Democrats propose them for other workers. So which is it, Mr. Beck? Are these benefits good when you provide them to your employees, but evil when we try to provide them to all Americans?" Beck's voice came out as a desperate shout. "This is ridiculous. You're twisting everything. I've spent my entire career fighting for freedom and liberty." "No, Mr. Beck," Crockett replied quietly, her words cutting through his bluster. "You spent your career profiting from fear and division. You've made millions by making Americans afraid of each other. And when someone finally calls you on it, you can't handle the truth." Laura Mitchell, sensing the segment had reached its climax, turned to the camera. We're going to take another quick commercial break. When we return, we'll have final thoughts from our guests. As the cameras cut away, Beck sat slumped in his chair, his face a mask of defeat. Crockett gathered her papers calmly, her mission clear. She had come to expose the hypocrisy at the heart of Beck's media empire, and she had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The stage was set for the fallout, and America was watching. The CNN studio in Atlanta buzzed with a charged silence as the cameras came back from the commercial break. The atmosphere had shifted irreversibly, the weight of Jasmine Crockett's relentless fact-based assault hanging heavy in the air. Glenn Beck sat slumped in his chair, his navy blue suit now seeming to swallow his diminished frame. The fire that had once defined his presence was gone, replaced by a hollow stare, his hands still clutching crumpled notes as if they could salvage his unraveling reputation. Across from him, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett remained poised, her folder of meticulously gathered evidence resting on the table, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Beck's visible distress. CNN host Laura Mitchell, her professionalism barely concealing her astonishment at the spectacle, took a deep breath to steer the segment toward its conclusion. "We're back with Glenn Beck and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett," Laura said, her voice steady but tinged with the awareness of the historic moment unfolding. Before the break, we witnessed an intense exchange about media responsibility and accountability. Mr. Beck, would you like to share your final thoughts? Beck's eyes darted briefly to the camera, then back to the table. His voice, once commanding and theatrical, came out weak, almost pleading. "Laura, I think what we've seen tonight is a distraction from the real issues facing America. My work at Torchlight Media has always been about informing people, protecting liberty, and creating jobs. I've never claimed to be perfect, but I'm fighting for what I believe in, a free and prosperous America." The words fell flat, lacking the conviction that had once rallied millions to his cause. The audience, still reeling from Crockett's revelations, remained quiet, some exchanging skeptical glances. Beck's attempt to pivot back to his core message felt like a desperate grasp at relevance, and it wasn't working. Laura turned to Crockett. "Congresswoman, your closing remarks?" Crockett leaned forward slightly, her voice clear and resonant, each word chosen with precision. "What we've seen tonight is why we need more accountability in our media and our politics. We can't build a better future for America if we're constantly being lied to by people who profit from our division and fear. I didn't come here to attack Mr. Beck personally. I came here to hold him accountable for the hypocrisy he's built his career on. It's time we demand better, not just from our media, but from ourselves. We deserve leaders and voices who tell the truth, who fight for ordinary Americans, not just their own wealth and power." The audience broke into spontaneous applause, some standing as they clapped. Even Laura Mitchell seemed momentarily caught off guard by the intensity of the response. Beck's face reddened further, his jaw tight, but he said nothing, his silence speaking louder than any rebuttal could have. Laura wrapped up the segment with a quick nod to the camera. "Thank you to both of our guests for a remarkable discussion. We'll continue to follow this story and its impact. Stay with us." As the cameras stopped rolling, Beck gathered his papers with shaking hands and left the studio without a word to anyone. His staff, waiting in the wings, exchanged worried glances, already fielding frantic calls from advertisers and investors. Crockett, by contrast, shook hands with Laura and the crew, her demeanor professional and gracious, even in victory. She knew what she had accomplished, not just a personal triumph, but a seismic shift in how political debates could be fought and won. Within minutes of the segment's end, the internet erupted. The hashtag Crockett Crushes Beck began trending, amassing over 300,000 posts within the first hour. Video clips of Beck's meltdown and Crockett's calm, fact-driven takedown spread like wildfire across social media platforms. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, with headlines like Texas Congresswoman dismantles conservative media titan and Glenn Beck left speechless in CNN showdown, dominating feeds. Progressive activists celebrated Crockett as a hero, while conservative commentators struggled to spin the narrative in Beck's favor. By the next morning, the fallout was undeniable. A major newspaper published an in-depth investigation into Torchlight Media's finances, confirming every detail Crockett had presented and adding new revelations about Beck's lavish personal spending. The report detailed a $10 million vacation home purchase in Texas, made even as Torchlight laid off dozens of employees and slashed salaries for others. The article quoted former employees who described a chaotic work environment, with Beck's erratic leadership and obsession with maintaining his public image driving the company toward financial ruin. Beck's response only deepened the damage. In a 15-minute video posted to Torchlight Media's platform, he attempted to defend himself, but his emotional and defensive tone backfired. "I'm under attack by progressive operatives who want to silence the truth," he said, his voice breaking as he fought back tears. "They're trying to destroy me because I'm standing up for America." The video went viral, but not for the reasons Beck had hoped. Late-night comedians seized on it, juxtaposing clips of his emotional breakdown with Crockett's unflappable delivery. "It's like watching a lion tamer take on a house cat," one host quipped to roaring laughter. Conservative media's response was tepid at best. Some outlets, long envious of Beck's prominence, distanced themselves, issuing vague statements about the need for credible voices in the movement. Others tried to defend him, but their arguments were drowned out by the overwhelming evidence Crockett had presented, all of it drawn from public records and impossible to dispute. Even Beck's former network, where he'd risen to fame, declined to give him a platform, with one prominent host offering only a brief comment. "Glenn's always been passionate, but we need to focus on the bigger picture." For Crockett, the debate was a turning point. Her social media following surged by hundreds of thousands in the days that followed, with supporters praising her preparation and courage. Democratic fundraising platforms reported a spike in donations, many citing Crockett's performance as their inspiration. Progressive leaders hailed her as a model for how to confront conservative media. "This is what it looks like to fight back with facts and fearlessness," one prominent Congresswoman posted online, sharing a clip of Crockett's most devastating moments. But the victory came with challenges. Conservative operatives, stung by Crockett's success, began digging into her background, searching for anything to discredit her. They found little. Her finances were clean, her public statements consistent, her career built on a foundation of hard work and advocacy. Still, the scrutiny underscored how threatening her approach was to the conservative media establishment. Crockett had exposed their vulnerabilities, and they weren't going to let it happen again without a fight. Meanwhile, Torchlight Media began to crumble. Within a week of the debate, the company lost nearly half of its major advertisers, with several citing concerns about credibility as their reason for pulling out. Subscription numbers plummeted as thousands of viewers canceled their memberships, unwilling to continue supporting a platform now synonymous with hypocrisy. Beck's upcoming book tour was quietly postponed, and two major conservative conferences canceled his speaking engagements, citing a need to reassess their programming. Beck tried to mount a comeback, appearing on smaller conservative podcasts and video channels, but his usual charisma was gone. He sounded defeated, his arguments circling back to complaints about unfair treatment and coordinated attacks. Each appearance only reinforced the image of a man whose credibility had been shattered in a single, devastating debate. The broader impact on conservative media was immediate. Advertisers grew wary of supporting inflammatory content, fearing their brands could be tied to the next figure exposed as a fraud. Some networks implemented stricter fact-checking protocols, a reluctant acknowledgement that the era of unchallenged misinformation was waning. Republican politicians, too, began to distance themselves from the more extreme media personalities, canceling appearances on shows hosted by figures with questionable credibility. The fear of a Crockett moment loomed large, a warning that facts could dismantle even the most entrenched media empires. For Crockett, the victory opened new doors. Invitations poured in for her to appear on major news shows, speak at universities, and headline fundraising events. Her colleagues in Congress sought her advice on media strategy, eager to replicate her success. But she remained focused, aware that her approach, rooted in research, preparation, and unapologetic truth-telling, had changed the game. She wasn't just a rising star. She was a blueprint for a new kind of political fighter. As the dust settled, one thing was clear. The CNN debate had been more than a clash of personalities. It was a reckoning for a media ecosystem built on fear and division. Crockett had shown that truth, wielded with precision and courage, could topple giants. But the story wasn't over. The long-term consequences for Beck, for Crockett, and for American political discourse were just beginning to unfold. The echoes of the CNN debate in Atlanta reverberated far beyond the studio's walls. What had unfolded in those explosive 90 seconds, followed by the relentless escalation, had reshaped the political and media landscape in ways neither Glenn Beck nor Jasmine Crockett could have fully anticipated. For Beck, the fallout was catastrophic, a public unraveling that threatened to dismantle his decades-long career. For Crockett, it was a triumph that catapulted her into the national spotlight, but also painted a target on her back. As the weeks turned into months, the consequences of their confrontation became a defining moment in American political discourse, a masterclass in accountability that would be studied and debated for years to come. In the immediate aftermath, Beck's empire began to crumble under the weight of Crockett's revelations. Torchlight Media, once a beacon for conservative audiences, faced a financial and reputational crisis unlike any in its history. By the end of the first month, the company had lost over 40% of its major advertisers, with brands citing concerns about credibility and public perception as their reason for withdrawing. Subscription numbers for Torchlight's streaming service plummeted, with tens of thousands of viewers canceling their memberships, unwilling to support a platform now synonymous with hypocrisy. The company's stock price, already shaky, took a nosedive, fueling rumors of a potential sale or bankruptcy. Beck himself became a shadow of his former persona. Once a commanding figure whose fiery monologues drew millions, he now appeared diminished, his public appearances marked by a defensive tone that lacked his signature bravado. In a last-ditch effort to salvage his reputation, he appeared on a series of smaller conservative podcasts and video channels, attempting to reframe the debate as a coordinated attack by progressive operatives. But his arguments fell flat, and his emotional outbursts, sometimes teetering on the edge of tears, only reinforced the image of a man whose credibility had been shattered. "I've been fighting for America's soul," he insisted in one interview, his voice cracking. "They want to silence me because I'm telling the truth." But the clips of Crockett's calm, fact-driven takedown, now viewed millions of times online, told a different story. The media piled on. Investigative journalists, inspired by Crockett's meticulous research, dug deeper into Torchlight Media's operations. A second major expose, published by a prominent news outlet, revealed further details about Beck's personal spending, including private jet travel and a multi-million-dollar art collection, all funded while his company laid off workers and struggled to pay its debts. Former Torchlight employees came forward with stories of a toxic workplace, describing Beck's erratic leadership and obsession with maintaining his public image at all costs. These revelations painted a picture of a man who had preached fiscal responsibility to his audience while living a life of excess behind the scenes. Conservative media, once a unified front, began to fracture. Some outlets, wary of being associated with Beck's tarnished brand, distanced themselves entirely. Others offered half-hearted defenses, but the overwhelming evidence, public records, financial filings, and internal documents, made it impossible to fully rally behind him. Even his former network, where he had risen to fame, refused to offer him airtime, with one prominent host dismissing questions about Beck with a curt, "He's doing his thing, and we're focused on ours." The conservative ecosystem, long reliant on figures like Beck to drive outrage and engagement, faced a reckoning. Advertisers grew cautious, demanding stricter fact-checking from networks and personalities to avoid being linked to the next public implosion. 3 months after the debate, Beck made a quiet announcement that stunned his remaining supporters. In a brief statement posted to Torchlight's website, he declared he was stepping back from daily broadcasting to focus on new projects. Industry insiders saw it for what it was: a face-saving exit for a man whose career as a major media figure was effectively over. Torchlight Media limped along, but its influence waned, its audience fragmented, and its future uncertain. Rumors swirled of potential buyouts, but no buyers emerged, wary of inheriting a brand now toxic in the eyes of many. For Jasmine Crockett, the debate was a springboard to national prominence. Her performance became a blueprint for progressive politicians, a demonstration that preparation and courage could dismantle even the most entrenched media giants. Invitations flooded in. Major news networks, university speaking engagements, and Democratic fundraising events all clamored for her presence. Her social media following grew exponentially, with supporters dubbing her the truth teller and sharing clips of her debate performance as a rallying cry for accountability. Democratic strategists took note, organizing Crockett-style media training sessions to teach candidates how to research opponents and wield facts like weapons. Her colleagues in Congress sought her counsel, eager to replicate her ability to confront misinformation head-on. But success came with challenges. Conservative operatives, stung by Crockett's victory, launched a relentless campaign to discredit her. They scoured her background, searching for financial missteps, questionable votes, or personal scandals. They found little. Her career as a civil rights attorney and legislator was marked by transparency and consistency. But the attacks persisted, a sign of how threatening her approach was to the conservative media machine. Anonymous online campaigns spread rumors, and right-wing commentators began targeting her with baseless accusations, hoping to tarnish her rising star. Crockett, however, remained unfazed. "I've been fighting injustice my whole life," she said in an interview. "If they think a few smears are going to stop me, they don't know who they're dealing with." Her work in Congress continued to reflect the pragmatism that had defined her career. She pushed for legislation to expand healthcare access, improve infrastructure, and support job training programs in her district, all while maintaining the rigorous research that had made her debate performance so effective. Her ability to bridge practical policy with fearless advocacy earned her respect across party lines, though some Republicans privately grumbled about the Crockett effect. A newfound wariness among GOP leaders about appearing on platforms where they might face similar scrutiny. The broader impact on American political discourse was profound. The debate became a case study in accountability, cited by pundits and academics as a turning point in the fight against misinformation. Progressive activists argued that Crockett had raised the bar, proving that facts, when wielded with precision, could dismantle empires built on fear and division. Some worried, however, that the confrontation had escalated the partisan arms race, encouraging both sides to dig deeper into personal attacks rather than focus on policy. "Crockett showed us how to win," one political analyst wrote, "but we need to be careful that accountability doesn't become character assassination." The conservative media ecosystem felt the ripples most acutely. Networks and personalities, wary of being the next to face a Crockett moment, began implementing stricter editorial standards. Advertisers demanded greater transparency, and some platforms saw a decline in funding as brands pulled back from controversial content. Republican politicians, too, grew cautious, canceling appearances on shows hosted by figures with questionable credibility. The fear of being exposed as a hypocrite or fraud reshaped how conservative media operated, forcing a reluctant shift toward accountability. For Crockett, the victory was bittersweet. She had achieved her goal, exposing the hypocrisy at the heart of Beck's empire. But the attention brought new pressures. Her every move was scrutinized, her every statement dissected. Yet she remained steadfast, using her platform to advocate for truth and justice. "This isn't about one debate or one person," she told a packed audience at a university event. "It's about building a future where we value facts over fear, where we hold the powerful accountable, no matter who they are." A year after the debate, the story of Jasmine Crockett and Glenn Beck had become legendary. For Beck, it marked the end of an era, his influence reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked hypocrisy. Torchlight media continued to struggle, its relevance fading as new voices emerged to fill the void. For Crockett, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where she emerged as a leader in a movement to reclaim truth in American politics. Her performance was a reminder that one person, armed with research and courage, could challenge giants and win. The revolution had been televised, and the people had watched a masterclass in accountability. As America grappled with the challenges of polarization and misinformation, Crockett's example stood as a beacon, a call to demand better, to seek the truth, and to never back down from a fight worth having. The question now was not just who would be next to face such accountability, but whether more leaders would rise to follow Crockett's lead. In a democracy built on trust, her voice rang clear. The truth was still the most powerful weapon of all.